Has anyone in the group stood out? Charles asked Miranda. She hesitated for a moment. The top 3 fighters are students of mine, she said at last, her voice shaking a little. I know I'm a little biased, but I promise it's the truth. She was nervous to tell Charles this, because she took judging such matters very seriously, and was concerned that he might think she was showing favoritism. She hadn't expected her students to fare so well, and was worried that this would anger him. However, the fact of the matter remained that none of his nearly 200 students had posed much of a challenge to Miranda's top 3. She was relieved then when he smiled and said, They've been fighting at your side all this time. It's only natural they would have picked up a thing or two from you. He wasn't surprised at all by the outcome. Other than Tina and a couple of others, his students had all been under the military's protection from the start. Although they had struggled through dark times, they hadn't experienced much in the way of direct combat. Miranda's students were different. They had traveled with her all the way from their original school to the military base in Montreal, and then also the great distance from there to the fortress, facing countless battles along the way. With Charles's permission, Anthony had then taught them the various methods of cultivation, making them the first group of students to learn how to cultivate at all. So it was no wonder that their direct fighting experience and cultivation training had turned them into such impressive martial artists. It was true that some of them had decided to live as stable a life as possible under the protection of the military, but they were still Miranda's followers and did everything they could to save others. In other words, these students were the best of the best, and it was no surprise that they had fared so well in Charles's tests. Miranda sighed with relief. I'm glad you don't blame me. Of course I don't blame you, said Charles. Besides, before long we won't have to worry about such meaningless things as which of us has the better students. Meaningless? Asked Miranda, a slight edge to her voice. What do you mean? He didn't respond at first. What he meant was that the outside world held many dangers, and they would need to cast away any internal competition if they were to have a chance of survival out there. They needed to work as one unit, one family. In such dark days as they were living through, a stranger might stab them in the back without thinking twice. But these desperate times also made it easier to form strong friendships. With enemies at every turn, a good friend was more precious than anything. But Miranda had misunderstood. When Charles had called her students' success meaningless, she had thought he had been hinting that the 2 of them would soon be starting a family, and so the line separating the students that belonged to him and those that belonged to her would dissolve. She was keen for their feelings for one another not to affect their running of the alliance, though, and she was glad that he didn't seem to be in much of a hurry to make the next move. In this new world, it wasn't unusual to have several partners. Although infidelity was still frowned upon, it wasn't considered as morally reprehensible as in earlier times. Some of the others in the alliance could sense the tension between the 2 of them. It left them confused and a little worried. Is Miranda falling for Charles? Dale wondered. Then where does that leave Alice? Alice stood nearby, her eyes downcast. Charles had hardly hidden his feelings for Miranda from her, and naturally she couldn't help harboring some ill feelings for the 2 of them. Still, there wasn't much that she could do other than accept the situation, and so she tried to swallow her sadness. Charles continued to watch the battle for a while, taking note of a few people who performed particularly well. Although he decided that he would focus mainly on training these elite fighters, he also paid special attention to a young man of slight build, whose technique wasn't as refined as the others', but who more than compensated for this in his determination. His name was Jonah Lawrence. He was still quite weak and hadn't even reached the 2nd level, but he faced every fight as if his life depended on it. Charles had been observing him for a while and had decided that Jonah was worth investing in. With the right training, he would overcome his shortcomings and emerge as a truly special fighter. Charles knew that history was full of naturally talented warriors who failed on the battlefield because they had never needed to fully apply themselves. On the other hand, those who had started with nothing were often the ones who cultivated the willpower to fight to the bitter end. After dark, everyone broke apart to carry out their respective duties. Some teams left the survival base to hunt zombies and animals in the nearby area. These places had mostly been plundered clean, but they still served as a good hunting ground for those who were keen to practice their skills. Charles admired people who proactively honed their wits and fighting abilities. The continued existence of the survival base relied on people who dared to seek danger, even on the few occasions that danger wasn't seeking them. Of course, some of these people lost their lives out there, but as far as Charles was concerned, the risks were outweighed by the opportunities. When he returned to his quarters, he wrote down the names of 11 students on a piece of paper. These were the 11, besides Miranda, that he felt showed the most promise. After a brief moment's hesitation, he ended the list with a 12th name, Jonah Lawrence. The young man still needed plenty of observation and training, but Charles felt sure it would pay off. He could feel a headache coming on. It wasn't that he couldn't think of a next step in his plans, but that he couldn't choose between the many that now presented themselves. His team of martial artists was like a blank canvas, and it was up to him how to make best use of them. If he could ensure that they were trained by only the best of the best, he knew that they could achieve great things. Still, this prospect didn't leave him satisfied. He felt that training them to become just another elite force would be a waste of their potential. After all, if they were trained as nothing but a special forces group, how could they ever hope to surpass the other special forces in the world? He thought about some of the elite teams of warriors from his own timeline, but was interrupted when Alice walked in. She crossed the room to stand at his side and picked up the piece of paper on his desk. 12 names, she said, smiling. Like the Knights of the Round Table. What are they for? To protect me? You hardly need protecting, said Charles, putting his arm around her. But then he stopped in his tracks. What did she just say? He thought. The Knights of the Round Table. Alice's wording had given Charles an idea. He had the names of the 12 greatest warriors in the Alliance. This was a perfect number to form his own order of knights. When the world finally turned away from using projectile weaponry, as Charles knew it would, the soldier on horseback would be a much more formidable fighter than an infantry on foot. The creation of such a cavalry was no easy task. Anybody with an understanding of history knew that the amount of grain required to feed a warhorse was many times more than the supplies needed to feed a single soldier. And as the animals of the world became more and more mutated, their need for food would only increase. In order to keep a cavalry going, food would have to be rationed elsewhere. And with a shortage of food came the risk that people might start to think of the horses themselves as food. This would not be a new problem. Many people in history had resorted to eating their own mounts to survive. More importantly, ordinary mounts would pose no threat to the increasing number of paranormals, who would easily take them down with their floods of spells. And even if the enemy army had no paranormals, they would only need to arm themselves with long blades and form a wide line to take down any charging knights. So it was clear that forming an order of knights was risky. With the costs appearing to outweigh any benefits, Charles hadn't considered it before now. He had thought it far better to improve the strength of his followers and use the little food they had to feed as many as they could. However, Charles also knew that in ancient times, knights were said to have a special connection with the world of the dead, allowing them to control the gates of hell that formed in certain people's bodies. This was the reason that knights in the old stories were able to summon armies of the dead to fight on their side. In fact, the reason that zombies had first invaded this world was that just such a knight had once overdrawn too much power in battle, and had opened a path for the dead to cross through. And now Alice had a gate of hell in her body. Charles had read of how to communicate with hellish creatures. If he could use this ancient knowledge to control the gate, it might be possible to form a powerful order of knights after all. The task wouldn't be without its dangers, of course, but deciding not to use Alice's power would be like a person freezing to death, refusing to light a fire for fear that they would burn themselves. In this dangerous new world, Charles had already died before. Having been through that, the dangers of something going wrong with the Gate of Hell posed little risk. Still, he needed to ask Alice's opinion. She was so loyal that he felt confident she would agree to his plan. But he needed to ask her all the same. Alice, he said, do you remember when we talked about the Gate of Hell? Of course, she replied. I'm hardly likely to forget that I have a doorway to the underworld inside me. You said it's where I get a large part of my strength from, but that if I don't learn to control it, it could lead to disaster. There were gaps in her knowledge of her paranormal abilities, but she still knew that this thing inside her was very dangerous. If she allowed the hellish creatures to use her as their passage into this world, there was no knowing the havoc they could wreak. All weapons can be used to hurt others, of course, said Charles, but they can also hurt the wielder. The Gate of Hell in your body is no different, but I have a plan for how we can use it to benefit us, with your permission. He explained his idea about the Order of Knights, without holding anything back. He trusted her fully. When he finished, she asked, if I refuse, will you still go ahead with the plan anyway? Charles shook his head and said firmly, no. To him, the Order of Knights would only be a bonus to the strength that they already had. If Alice wasn't willing to take the risk, he wouldn't force her. "Then I agree," she said. Charles frowned. "What convinced you?" he asked. He thought he knew all about the human heart, yet the people around him were still capable of throwing him for a loop like this at times. "You always act like you don't care about other people," she said, "but you spend all your time trying to save them. The sad thing is that you know you'll never be able to save them all." She had seen enough tragedy in the past few days to know the truth of this, and she understood that his new plan was the best way to save as many people as possible. She could detect some sadness in his eyes, and could tell that he was thinking that she was right, that he really couldn't save that many people. Those who relied on others to pick them up would only fall again. Although in the future he would be hailed as a hero, in the present he felt powerless. He could protect some people for a while, but not forever. The people he admired in this day and age, such as Miranda, Anthony, and Hugh, were united in their desperation to survive. They didn't need anybody to watch their backs, because they were already watching out for themselves. This was the factor that would decide who lived and who died in the coming struggles. "I might not know all the details of this Knight's Order," Alice said, "but I do know one thing. I know that I can trust you to find the right way through all of this, and so I know you'd never ask me to take any risks if they weren't absolutely necessary." Just because Alice was pure and kind didn't mean that she was naive and foolish. Whenever she encountered danger in this perilous new world, she was able to keep her head while those around her panicked. While Charles based most of his decisions either on pure reason or on hot-blooded instinct, Alice asked only if a certain choice would help Charles and the Alliance. As a result, she trusted Charles's judgment on the matter completely. It was enough for her to understand that if there was no need for her to take the risk of using the Gate of Hell, he would never have asked her to do so. She didn't even spare a thought for the fact that without him, she might have been swallowed by the gate already. He hugged her tightly. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he had ever thanked her for anything. The reason he had said it now wasn't that she had agreed to his plan, but that in agreeing to it, she had shown that she understood him in a way nobody else ever had. He knew what the next 10 years held, and the tough decisions they would need to make to get through them. This foreknowledge had often made him feel out of sync with the new era, where people had different ideas of what risks were acceptable. Even his parents and Lena found it difficult to fully understand him, and it made him feel lonely to be set apart like this. But in Alice, he had finally found someone who understood him. She was like a light in the darkness. "What should I do?" she asked. "I'm not in a hurry yet," he said. "If we're going to build a true Knight's Order, we'll need to be prepared. You have to learn how to control your strength. The greater your control, the safer things will be when we tackle the gate." "All right," she said. "I'll work hard." She knew that after reaching the 5th level, she had accumulated sufficient soul energy, and that the task now was to learn to control it. As her strength increased, it would become more and more difficult to control, with a greater danger that it would backfire her. Becoming a paranormal and learning how to cultivate was certainly more fun than the alternative, but it did require managing the risks involved. Charles smiled and took her hand. "Well, let's not think about such serious things tonight. It's getting late. Maybe we should turn in." He looked at her coyly. She smiled at him and let him lead her to the bedroom. The next morning, Charles was on his way to observe the training of his 12 chosen Alliance members when Greg stopped him. "We got the radio working again," Greg said. "There's news." Although the radio signal couldn't cover the whole country, they had finally managed to communicate with the major military districts. Charles's special relationship with the military meant that he was told any news they managed to pick up. "This is about stellar technology?" he asked. Ever since he had told the military about stellar technology, the Army had conducted investigations into the organization and had found a great deal of evidence of its crimes. Many of its deeds went against all standards of ethics or human rights, or at least how such things were viewed in the new era. The military had decided to put a stop to it once and for all. Stellar technology had been silent for a while, ever since the most recent destruction of one of their bases. So as far as Charles was concerned, it seemed as good a time as any to make a move. "It's bad news," said Greg. "A large number of zombies have descended on Butte.
The Montreal military is sending most of their forces to help. We have to stop the spread of the zombies at all costs, otherwise we'll lose the entire region. Butte and its surrounding area were densely populated, so it was understandable that so many zombies had turned up there. In the past, the military hadn't had the time or resources to protect the region, but since they had taken some of their troops away from other areas, they were able to concentrate their forces on Butte. If they hadn't been able to repair the radio, the Alliance wouldn't even have heard about the situation. But now that they had learned of it, it was clear that this took precedence over dealing with stellar technology. Charles nodded. I understand. This is the priority. Although stellar technology was abominable, there would be time to take care of it afterwards. If they let the zombies in Butte get out of hand, though, the consequences would be disastrous. If the entire region fell, what use would it be to take on stellar technology at all? Miranda was puzzled. How did this happen? Because she had traveled around a fair amount in the early stages of the disaster, she had some understanding of the situation in Butte. But this was the first time she had learned that the situation was so desperate there. The quality of the buildings in Butte is pretty good, said Greg. As long as they keep the defenses up, most zombies aren't able to break through. A few days ago, though, they were attacked by zombies with sharp claws that could easily break through their walls. Miranda was dejected by the news. The only way that anyone was able to survive for long in this world was to stockpile resources and find somewhere safe to hide. But as the zombies grew stronger, it was becoming more and more difficult to find anywhere that felt totally safe from their attack. Smaller, more poorly defended regions had fallen to them long ago, but now even the bigger cities were struggling to defend themselves. In the face of such an enemy, Miranda felt powerless. It was hard for her to see how anybody could hope to survive this horrible time. Charles thought over Greg's words before saying, if we're up against mutated zombies, it's vital that we understand the best way to fight them. Don't you guys know how to take them on? But then he stopped when he looked up at Greg, who had gone as pale as a sheet. When the members of the group saw the change in Greg's expression, they fell silent, confused. They couldn't work out what Charles had said that had shocked him so much. After a pause, Greg hesitantly said, our soldiers aren't scared of anything. If that's what you're implying. Charles shook his head. I know you have many people under your command willing to sacrifice themselves, he said. But if you think this situation will be solved by sacrifice after sacrifice, you're wrong. You and your soldiers think that as long as you're prepared to die, you don't need to care about anything else. Who do you think you are? Asked Greg, raising his voice. What right do you have to blame the people who sacrifice themselves to keep you safe? Charles sneered. What right do I have? I'll remind you that the Alliance has done a pretty good job of protecting you, too. Greg clenched his fist but said nothing. What's going on? Asked Miranda. What are you guys talking about? Humans are naturally at a disadvantage when facing zombies, said Charles. Even our serums aren't a guarantee against becoming infected. And besides, there's only a limited number of people we can give them to. Our main defense then rests in the power of our weaponry. Miranda frowned. So what's the problem? She asked. If we fight zombies on open ground, our weapons can be very effective, he replied. But if we're trying to take on a city, well, you saw how stellar technology coped with that. Miranda instantly understood. Once stellar technology had taken on the Alliance on open ground, they had won victory after victory. But when they had tried to attack the Alliance members hiding inside the buildings, it had been a completely different story. Under cover of the buildings, the Alliance had been able to defend itself a lot better, making use of its defenses to hide and launch sneak attacks when the enemy passed by. They had effectively forced stellar technology into close combat, where the Alliance's melee weapons had dealt a lot more damage. But that was a battle between humans, said Miranda. This time we're dealing with zombies. As long as we can use a loud sound to draw them out of the built-up areas, we shouldn't have any problems defeating them. If it was that easy, said Charles, then why would Montreal send so many of their troops over to Butte? There was a pause, and then Greg said, Zombies may not be as intelligent as humans, but they have the same survival instincts. We've seen zombies seek out advantages in battle and avoid risky maneuvers. We've even seen some of them command others to fight. Miranda was shocked. She'd encountered many dangers in the outside world, but the zombies she had seen had been dumb creatures with no free will to speak of. She had never expected that they might evolve to such a level of intelligence. If what Greg had said was true, It meant they were up against a much more formidable foe than she had anticipated. "The army knows how to fight," said Charles. "But in order to have an advantage, it needs to dispatch a large number of troops to the battlefield." "Because we're protecting a large number of people in Butte," interrupted Greg. "And what's to keep all those people from getting caught in the crossfire?" Charles asked. Greg looked at the floor, his face paler than ever. An awkward silence fell on the group until Greg's radio crackled, and a voice said, "Let me talk to Charles." It was the deep voice of a man clearly used to wielding authority. Understood," stammered Greg. He raised the volume on the radio and placed it on the table. "Let me introduce myself," said the man on the other end. "My name is Colonel Richard Morrison. I'm in charge of the Montreal military." The Alliance members looked at each other in surprise. "Is this military big shot really negotiating with Charles?" Miranda wondered. Then she realized that the radio must have been on the whole time, that the colonel had heard their whole conversation. She glanced at Charles out of the corner of her eye, but he was as expressionless as ever. "Colonel Morrison," he said, "do you agree with what you've heard me say just now?" He respected the colonel very much. He knew from his experience of the future that Richard was willing and able to remain calm in even the direst of situations. But this wasn't a blind respect. If Richard were about to make a foolish or cowardly decision leading to the deaths of innocent people, then Charles wasn't afraid to stand in his way. He wouldn't be able to just sit back and do nothing. "The information I gave Greg is false," said Richard. Greg's eyes widened in shock. Charles tensed. "What?" he asked. His mind had gone blank. He felt as though someone had pulled the rug from under him, a feeling he wasn't used to. If the information was false, he thought, then why did he listen into our whole conversation about it? The answer was obvious. He had wanted to hear their reaction. A chill went down Charles's spine. Ever since he had come back to life, he had looked down on everyone around him, firm in the belief that his knowledge of the future put him above everyone else. He realized now, though, that for all his experience, he was still a relatively young man. He might have seen a lot, but that didn't mean that everyone around him was a fool. "I've been monitoring your situation closely," Richard said. "In times like these, I'm interested less in the number of people we save, and more in the character of those who survive. And I've become very interested in your character, Charles." Charles took a deep breath and then he asked, "What do you want me to do?" Although Charles respected Richard very much, he was wary. He understood that there were people in power who needed to make difficult decisions on who should be sacrificed and who should be saved. He knew that it was best not to get too close to such people. "Do you have any suggestions for our next move?" asked Richard. Charles was startled. He had already had a feeling that Richard had some understanding of their plight, but the directness of this question proved it. It also showed that he knew something of Charles's history. He likely didn't know that Charles had been reborn, but he clearly had some knowledge of his life. "Butte is near the mountains," Charles said after some consideration. "I say we seal it off completely." Richard was silent for a moment, and then he said, "We don't have enough food for a siege." "There isn't much food, but I think there will be enough," Charles replied. After another pause, Richard said, "Thank you for your advice. I'll consider it. Greg, please return to your duties." "Yes, sir," said Greg. He turned off the radio and shuffled off in a daze. Charles sighed. He'd been worried that Richard might interrogate him about his secrets, but instead the colonel's questions had been all about the matter at hand. This was what Charles trusted most about Richard, his intelligence. Anyone in charge of such a large section of the military couldn't afford to beat around the bush. He hadn't been trying to test Charles, but to get Charles's honest take on the situation. "Did you really mean what you said just now?" asked Miranda. "Do you really believe in the plan you told to Richard?" He nodded. "We shouldn't question that the military knows what it's doing, but they need to take my plan into consideration. Clearly, they're trying to decide whether they should rush in and save everyone they can, or approach the situation more strategically." "What do you think they'll do?" she said. "In the past, they wouldn't think twice about charging in, no matter how many troops they lost," he replied. "If it meant saving one more civilian, they'd act as quickly as possible without caring about their own lives." This had been the military strategy for years, sacrificing their own in order to save as many innocent lives as they could. But not all good intentions lead to good consequences, and naturally, this had led to the deaths of many soldiers. "Isn't that the best approach?" asked Miranda. "After all, doesn't that mean they'd save as many people as possible?" "But the soldiers are people too," he said. "Do soldiers deserve to be sacrificed just because they signed up to fight?" He raised his voice. "Just because they believe it's their duty to give up their lives doesn't mean we should just sit back and watch them die. And when all those who are willing to protect the people have died, where does that leave the rest of us?" "I understand," said Miranda. She was worried that she had been thinking about the situation all wrong. With the crisis in Butte, she had only considered the innocent people who needed to be saved from the zombies. She hadn't thought about the soldiers who would die in their place. "It's only natural for you to care about the weak and defenseless," said Charles. "It's that kind of compassion that makes us human. But people need to learn to fight for themselves, or else they'll always rely on the protection of others." He had seen this problem before, not only in society as a whole, but in individual families where the parents' love for their children kept those children from learning to stand on their own 2 feet. As far as Charles was concerned, it wasn't a case of right or wrong, but it was clear to him that they needed to understand the consequences of such an attitude. Clearly troubled, Miranda turned and left. She wondered if protecting the defenseless was really in their best interests. Was she really helping them? Or did she only do it so that she could tell herself that she was a good person? Watching her go, Charles sighed. He worried that he had gone too far, but a month had passed since the beginning of the disaster. If they didn't face up to the truth of the matter, they would never survive. He knew that Miranda's heart was in the right place, but he was concerned that her good intentions might lead to even more destruction down the line. When he turned his thoughts to the people under the military's protection, for example, he realized that the reason they had suffered such heavy casualties during the attack from the bugs was that they hadn't known how to fight for themselves, and had instead relied on the army to defend them. After the last battles, only a third or so had survived. They had focused too much on making a stable life in the fortress, on ensuring they had sufficient food and water, and it had kept them from learning how to defend themselves against the dangers outside. If the result of saving people was to render them weak and useless, what was the point of any of it? In times like these, Charles thought, it's difficult to know when you're helping someone and when you're harming them. Although he felt bad about how bluntly he had made his case for Miranda, he knew that she would come around to his point of view in time. How much time they had left, though, was something he was much less sure of. After hanging up, Colonel Richard Morrison asked the group in front of him, "Did you all hear that?" A young officer said, "Following Charles's suggestion would be a desecration of our duty. My soldiers aren't afraid of death. We'll make whatever sacrifices necessary." "Is your duty more important than the lives of civilians?" Richard asked. "My duty is to protect the lives of civilians." "Well, I have a suggestion then," Richard said. "Find a dark well and toss them all in it. Then protect it. What do you think of that idea?" The officer balled his fists. "You've gone too far." The other officers were also angry. They knew the colonel was only joking, but this wasn't something to make light of. Richard remained calm. "Too far," he said. "Let's take a more humane approach. Pack the people into a small building like sardines. We'll protect them around the clock and give them food and water regularly. Oh, but we can't forget that we'll have to send some of them out to collect food and water and fight monsters." He seemed to think of something else. "And with people in such close quarters, we'll also need doctors and nurses to give them regular physical and psychological examinations." The young officer said, "With all due respect, Colonel Morrison, please don't joke about this. It's a serious situation." "A serious situation indeed," a mocking voice said from outside the conference room. Lewis Harvey walked in and said, "But I'm afraid it's all already a joke. Their living conditions are terrible. Are we supposed to provide them with a better quality of life?" "What do you mean, Lewis?" Richard asked. "You're talking like we've brought in a bunch of helpless children," the young officer said. "Do you think I'm kidding?" Lewis snapped. "Have you even been in the fortress? Do you know what their lives are like now? Do you know how many of the people we saved are taking up arms and demanding better conditions?" The officer paused, deep in thought and unsure of what to say. He really had no idea what the fortress was like at that moment. He knew that it was a bit dirty and chaotic, but what did that matter as long as it helped them survive? He thought performing their duty as soldiers was the only thing that mattered. Richard said to Lewis, "Go on, tell them about the fortress. Or perhaps you should just take them there and show them." The young officer's brows drew together in confusion. Is there a problem with the fortress? He had been in charge of clearing out the monsters, but he didn't know much about the fortress beyond that. "Do you know what a pigsty looks like?" Lewis asked. "The filth? The inability to do anything but eat and sleep? These people used to have jobs and purposes. Whether they were happy or miserable, at least they were free to do as they pleased. But ever since we locked them up in the fortress, saying it's for their own protection, they've been living like pigs. Other than giving them food and water every day, what else do we do for them? Don't you think they want more than that? At least they're still alive, aren't they?" The young officer countered. "Alive," Lewis scoffed. "We live in a time when many people have turned into literal monsters. But even worse are the ones who turn into monsters on the inside. Those who can maintain both their dignity and their humanity are rare." He narrowed his eyes. "But what are we doing? These people have managed to hold on to their humanity, but we've taken away their dignity and are calling it protection." All the officers were stunned into silence. They had never thought of it like that before. They had just been following their duty, but they hadn't thought about what the people really needed. They were shocked that their actions had already caused such serious consequences. They had thought they were the guardians of humanity, but they had never imagined they would become its destroyers instead. "Before we attack Butte, let's go take a look at the fortress," Richard said with a sigh. "I think this is something we need to see with our own eyes. Otherwise, it's hard to believe that the people we've been protecting have been living like this. We protected their lives for the sake of our duty, but our duty is what destroyed their dignity." "A soldier's duty is to protect the people," Lewis said. "But if we crush the people's spirits in the process, what good is fulfilling our duty?" He walked out of the meeting room, but before he had gone far, he turned back and shouted, "Come with me. I'll take you all to see what exactly you're protecting." The officers hesitantly followed Lewis to the fortress. As he shuffled along at the back of the group, Richard sighed and muttered to himself, "I didn't expect the military to build such an unfit shelter. Charles, I don't care what secrets you have. What you're doing is still a light that guides people in the darkness. I hope you don't disappoint me." No one knew he had gone to the Dawn Alliance in secret. The Alliance's household registration system wasn't finished yet, and people were constantly joining, so he was able to pretend to be an ordinary person and slip in for a visit. This visit was the reason he had decided to trust Charles. He had seen the military fortress. Those who had nothing to do except collect food and water every day had dull looks in their eyes. It was a kind of mental torture for some, and the only way to release their inner anxiety was by doing something more active, like fighting enemies. He had originally thought this was a necessary, if miserable, step in the process of establishing a new world order. In time, everything would be better. But after he had visited the Dawn Alliance, he had realized that people there were living as if this disaster were already over. No one could avoid the apocalypse. The only way out was through. "Is there any news about Stellar Technology?" Charles asked Olivia in the meeting room. "I don't think they'll let this opportunity go." The zombie invasion in Butte was getting worse as the military attacked. If Stellar Technology did nothing to take advantage of the Dawn Alliance's vulnerability during the military's absence, then they wouldn't be the worthy opponent Charles thought them to be. "Since the army set off yesterday," Olivia reported, "there's been a big commotion at the military fortress, and Stellar Technology has been expanding their workforce." A mocking smile crept onto his face. "They're actually recruiting people. How ironic." It had been 3 days since the last military probe. According to that report, the military hadn't set off for Butte right away. Instead, they had gone to their own fortress first, and then they had disguised themselves as ordinary people and had walked around the Dawn Alliance's base. Charles had pretended not to notice. Let them see, he had thought. The Dawn Alliance had nothing to hide in its survival base, and there were too many people there for the military to try to stop their operations. Greg had told him that the survival base was like a slap in the face for the military. The members of the Dawn Alliance were all proactive. Very few of them relied on someone else to take care of them. Almost all of them worked hard to improve their lives. But things were very different at the military fortress. Life there was downright painful. The military's protective hand squeezed a little too tightly, but the people could do nothing about it. Their safety depended on that hand, even as it slowly suffocated them. The military had made some reforms, but the people had found the changes unsatisfactory. Most people know the evil things Stellar Technology has done, Olivia said, but not everyone trusts the military. Even after the military risked their lives to protect them, they still have their doubts. And after that reform, a lot of them left. The military had arranged jobs for every person and was now forcing them to work. If the people didn't work, there would be no distribution of resources. They were free to refuse. The choice was theirs. But the people were angry that the military was suddenly making them work for the food and water they had previously been given for free. Many of them had left, but they knew how dangerous the outside world was, and they also knew that many private organizations, including Stellar Technology, were recruiting members. Charles shook his head and laughed dryly. If they're stupid enough to do that, they deserve whatever misfortune comes their way. They'll all be dead soon, I'm sure. He knew very well that it was human nature to pursue strength. It didn't matter how evil a person was. If they were strong and attractive enough, people would follow them. Even if they were cruel murderers, they would still be revered. All it would take was a show of strength by Stellar Technology to draw the people in, even if they couldn't stand the organization's actions. Olivia was a little anxious. But how are we going to deal with them? The energy shield can effectively defend against many mutated insects, ordinary wild animals, and zombies. But if Stellar Technology attacks, I don't think the shield will stand a chance. Don't worry, I have my ways, Charles said. The biggest mistake Stellar Technology had made was to recruit a mob. It was the same mistake that had destroyed the Neal family. Only Kevin's faction had survived. Stellar Technology might have had their own methods to train and control their new recruits, but it was essentially the same situation. It was always the little things that brought down an army. There's another important thing we need to discuss, Olivia said. The Alliance is now divided into several forces, and everyone is fighting for power and land distribution. Charles was startled. Have the crops matured? She nodded. Because of the spring weather, the potatoes, the sweet potatoes, and a few other crops are ready. Food shortage isn't a problem anymore, but now everyone's thinking about how to distribute the crops. After all, food is the most valuable resource now. Although they had started to set up a currency system with the crystal cores, it wasn't circulating very well. Tools used for cultivation weren't quite significant enough for ordinary people, and food and water were still the most important measures of wealth to everyone. He thought for a moment. Let them work for it, he suggested. Stellar Technology wants to fight with us, and that's more pressing. We can just allocate resources according to who contributed more in battle against them. No, I'm in charge of distribution, she said, and I'll be held responsible. If we credit people according to their contributions, everyone will be unhappy with me. His idea sounded like a fair plan, but the execution of it wouldn't be. The biggest question was how to determine how much credit each person should get for their contributions. Charles shook his head. Don't worry, we'll figure it out. Olivia looked at him and frowned. He always had a confident look on his face. It was as if no problem was too difficult for him, but he was never willing to speak his mind. She found it frustrating, but she didn't blame him. Other people hadn't understood many of his previous decisions at the time, but afterward, his judgments had always proved wise. One case in point was his stubbornness when it came to his treatment of the Dawn Alliance. It was the eternal pain of the deputy mayors, but it was clear to her that snatching the fruits of everyone's hard work and making them submit to his will wholeheartedly was the kind of terrifying approach that might alienate the people. Olivia sighed and turned to leave. She had other Alliance matters to attend to. But Charles said, I'm going out for a while. Make sure everyone is on alert and prepared to defend the base if necessary. Then he got up and left. After he had taken control of the Stone Man, Charles let it continue to cultivate in the mine and absorb energy. But now he felt that the creature had been disturbed. Someone must have entered the ore vein there. Perhaps even someone from Stellar Technology. After all, the mine was extremely important to Stellar Technology. It was reasonable for them to want to seize it again, but Charles hadn't expected them to try so soon. Near the Stellar Technology mine, a new camp had been built. It wasn't that surprising that it had sprung up so quickly. It didn't take long to build a camp, even if trees were the only resource. And it took even less time with the help of advanced modern technology. Around the camp, about 10,000 people were mining with pickaxes. Their procedure was simple. Because the blue flame energy gems didn't form compounds with the ore, it was relatively simple to mine them. They crushed the ore to separate it from the gems, and then they moved the ore into a factory to purify and process the raw material. A certain number of people were responsible for transporting the waste out. In the middle of the camp stood a group of people holding large guns and other industrial weapons. They were fending off a few cyborg beasts. Charles was surprised. Have they already lost control of the cyborg beasts? He wondered. He looked a bit closer and saw that while some of the cyborg beasts cowered at the sight of the weapons, others rushed forward without a care. They were then shot and killed by the people with machine guns. Charles had a few guesses about what was going on. He had found some blood on the clothes he had collected from them before. The blood was probably why the cyborg beasts didn't dare approach the people. It wasn't as if the blood would harm the beasts, but it was like an animal marking its territory. The reason it worked was that it caused instinctive fear. But if the cyborg beast could overcome that fear, then the blood would be completely useless, and it was no longer a guarantee of safety. Charles wasn't sure what a beast needed to do to break through its fear, but he knew that hunger was more powerful than any kind of fear. A large vehicle pulled up and stopped at the edge of the camp. Armed soldiers escorted a group of people out of the vehicle and instructed them on what they were expected to do. When the people realized they'd been brought there to mine, they were indignant. They felt as if they had been deceived, and they expressed their dissatisfaction loudly. "This is asking too much! How is this any different than what the army wanted us to do? Didn't you say that if we joined you, we would have the chance to become paranormals? Liars! You're all liars!" Their complaints were answered by a burst of flame that turned one of the people into ash. Everyone froze in terror. They cried out in fear of their lives. "They killed someone! Let's get out of here! Run!" The chaos didn't last long. After 1/3 of the people were killed by the same ball of fire, the rest of them chose to obey. A Stellar Technology officer shouted with disdain, "Let me tell you something. You haven't done anything for us yet. Why should we give you such a precious opportunity? There's only one option for you now, and that's to work for us. If you work hard enough, then we'll give you a chance. And if you're not okay with all that, then you'll have to decide whether your fists are stronger than our bullets." These people had no choice. If they proved their worth, they wouldn't be miners for very long. After all, Stellar Technology treated paranormals fairly well. Paranormals could be supervisors instead of having to work themselves. They could also enjoy the feeling of being high and mighty, to say nothing of the generous compensation. The people still wanted to resist, but another look at the pile of ash on the ground convinced them not to. They didn't want to die like that. Charles didn't have the slightest bit of sympathy for these people's suffering. The military had saved their lives, but as soon as the military had asked them to work, the people had abandoned them. They couldn't get over the discrepancy. The military had provided food and water for free before, and then suddenly they had asked the people to start working for it. It seemed like a ridiculous change to them. Even if Charles set aside the moral component of it, he still thought these people were idiots. Nothing in the world came without work. Some people might argue that some things could be enjoyed for free, but that was only because some people had worked ahead of time to allow themselves or others to enjoy the fruits of their labor. He thought that only someone without a brain wouldn't understand a concept that simple. Maybe they thought Stellar Technology was running a charity and would let them become paranormals without doing anything in exchange. After all, Stellar Technology had mastered the procedure for turning people into paranormals. The military had spread the word about the realities of that process, repeatedly telling them about Stellar Technology's abominable experiments on live humans, but the people hadn't cared. The more the military stressed the matter, the more the people didn't believe it, Charles thought. They just used the military's hatred of Stellar Technology as ammunition in their revolt. He scowled out at the people. They had made their choice. Now they had to bear the consequences. In the past, the price for a choice like this wouldn't have been so dire. But in this new world, one wrong move could cost a person their life. Charles couldn't let them turn into valuable pawns for the enemy. He had to do something. It's already 5 o'clock. It should be getting dark soon, he muttered. He wasn't in a hurry, because making a hasty move was suicide. He waited half an hour for the sky to darken. As night descended, the miners grew tired and wanted to rest. A few tried to take advantage of the darkness and escape, but they were shot and killed before they got very far. Charles waited another hour before slowly emerging from his hiding place. Then he sent the lightning cadaver serpent to circle the Stellar Technology soldiers, supervising the miners. The night seemed to be on Charles's side. The moon was hidden by clouds, and even the stars had disappeared from the sky. He knew this was because the elemental energy between heaven and earth was getting denser. As time passed, the days would only become shorter. By the 10th year of the apocalypse, the light would last less than an hour a day. He wondered if he would live to see a day when there was no light at all. He shook the thoughts of the future away and focused on the enemy in front of him. The darker it grew, the more impractical it became to continue mining the ore. They had lights to help them see. The miners were tired, so the Stellar Technology supervisors gave everyone time to rest. They knew that if they overworked the people at night, it would be less efficient during the day. The Stellar Technology soldiers began dragging some of the women toward their tents with malicious intentions. Some of the men were filled with righteous indignation and rose up to stop the soldiers, but they were all shot and killed instantly. The soldiers resumed dragging the women toward their tents, but they had no idea that a long black snake was slithering their way. A paranormal soldier screamed shrilly as the creature dragged him away. The lightning cadaver serpent was very stealthy in the dark of night. It usually didn't make a sound when it attacked, but Charles had given it a special order. He wanted to alert the enemy and strike fear into everyone's hearts. After the serpent swallowed the soldier, it sank back into the darkness, searching for its next delicious prey. There was no shortage of targets to choose from, so it could take its time. There was a huge commotion in the vicinity of the attack, as everyone wondered where the creature had disappeared to. What kind of monster was that? We have to get out of here. We don't know when it'll come back. Let's go, run! One of the Stellar Technology officers cried. Stop! You're not going anywhere. He gave the order for the soldiers to secure the area. Gunfire rang through the air and stopped most of the people in their tracks. But a few of them panicked even more and ran straight into the line of fire, dying instantly. Then another paranormal screamed, Save me! This time, everyone stayed away. They had learned their lesson. The monster seemed to only kill one person at a time. Knowing that helped most of them overcome their panic a bit easier. Don't go over there. The monster is still there. No, now it's gone. Where did it go? The Stellar Technology soldiers tried their best to maintain order. Everyone stay calm. It's just a beast, one of them called. We'll find the monster's tracks and get rid of it. It's only killed 2 people, but dozens more died because they let their fear get the best of them. Don't panic if you don't want anyone else to die. The soldiers blamed the people's panicked reactions to the lightning cadaver serpent for the deaths they had caused with their machine guns, but no one dared object. They had seen what had happened to the people who had resisted earlier. All the chaos had given Charles the opportunity to sneak into the crowd. In the dark night, no one paid attention to him at all. The soldiers turned on some lights, but the beams only reached so far. A crack suddenly appeared in the ground, and a few of the soldiers staggered and fell into it. Just as they each let out a short scream, the crack closed again. It's a sneak attack, one cried. Before the crowd could fall into absolute chaos again, a few blue fireballs flew out of nowhere and burned them to ashes. It was rare for one person to have 2 types of power, so they naturally assumed the second attack was by someone new. There was no way for them to know how many enemies were hiding out there in the dark. They panicked anew and started to flee in all directions like the idiots Charles had supposed them to be. He wouldn't have expected them to react any differently at the slightest hint of danger. But as they fled, a pack of cyborg beasts came out of the buildings and attacked, creating even more havoc. In the darkness and confusion, even the soldiers could name their guns accurately. The cyborg beasts surrounded some of the soldiers, picking them off one by one and devouring them swiftly. More and more cyborg beasts emerged from the buildings. The crowd's fear deepened. Run! Staying here is suicide! Fear of death shattered everyone's rationality. Even though the soldiers were still blocking their escape route with machine guns, they charged at the blockade without a thought. The Stellar Technology officers gave an emergency order to stop them. Don't let them escape! Shoot! Shoot! Stop them! We can't let the cyborg beast break through! They knew that if word got out about this, Stellar Technologies' reputation would be negatively affected. Even in this new world, rumors and news spread like wildfire. No one had believed the military or the other people who were just trying their best to survive. But they would listen to the eyewitness accounts of anyone who made it out of this alive. The overlapping pops of continuous machine gun fire rent the air. One by one, the people dropped like flies. The terrifying cyborg beasts were mixed in with the crowd and were attacking the blockade as well. There was nothing else the soldiers could do. They just had to kill them all. These human lives meant nothing to them in the grand scheme of things. In all the chaos, Charles snuck into the factory where the ore was processed. The place was brightly lit by the glow of the crafting furnace. Although they didn't refine the ore at night, a lot of people, many of them shirtless, were still hard at work smashing the ore with huge hammers. Charles's gaze fell on some blue flame energy gems that had already been separated from the ore. Stellar Technology was very efficient, perhaps because of its enormous workforce. 10,000 people could get a lot done in a short amount of time. In just one day, they had already extracted enough ore to make a small hill. Charles looked it over and estimated there was more than 30 tons of ore there, and because the blue flame energy gems needed no further purification, he guessed that pile contained roughly 20 tons of pure gems. A man noticed Charles sneak in. He stood up and asked gruffly, "What's going on out there?" A woman standing next to him wiped her palms on her clothes and gave Charles a look of dissatisfaction. She didn't say anything, but she had heard the commotion outside. She knew something must have happened. Charles moved quickly. Instead of answering, he gave them each a blow to the head that knocked them unconscious. The other workers who were crushing the ore gave him curious looks, and then lowered their heads back to their work. They thought that whatever had happened outside was none of their business. Their supervisors' disputes had nothing to do with them, because their situation wouldn't change no matter who was in charge. When Charles saw the workers acting as if nothing had happened, he felt a wave of sad concern in his heart. The country didn't lack heroes, but there would always be many more cowards who just stood by and did nothing. He understood why they had been reluctant to resist the soldiers before, but now he was giving them a true chance to escape during the chaos, and they still weren't taking advantage of it. "All right then," he said, narrowing his eyes at them. "If you're going to be this way, then I'll send you to a place where your energy can be put to good use." He began knocking the workers out one by one and putting them all into his energy storage space with the rest of the captives. They would have worked their lives away as pawns of Stellar Technology if he hadn't found them. At least in the energy storage space, he knew that their efforts would be used for something good. When the workers realized Charles was attacking them, one of them begged, "Please spare us! We haven't been slacking off, I swear!" Not wishing to upset them further, Charles hurried to knock the rest of them out, thinking that he should have known these cowardly people would never stand up to him. Just as he put the last worker in the energy storage space, a pale, muscular man walked into the factory and looked around. When he saw that only Charles remained, he demanded, "What's going on? What happened in here?" He was met with Charles's sword of death, and he swiftly collapsed to the ground. The man was a paranormal. He had refined the spiritual energy in his body so that he could increase his strength. Charles had learned that strength was the foundation of everything, and he recognized that this man was much more valuable than a simple worker. Although refining weapons gave Charles many benefits and superficial strength, he was afraid that if that was all he did, he would one day forget how to fight. He wasn't sure it was worth the long-term cost. That was why he had gone to the mines, to prove he was still strong enough to stand his ground against his enemies like a respectable paranormal. After collecting all the materials in the factory inside his energy storage space, Charles used the explosive flame amulet to blow up the entire factory. The loud explosion attracted everyone's attention. The Stellar Technology soldiers immediately sent teams to investigate, but they didn't return. The smoke obscured their vision, and Charles killed them easily. Then he turned his attention to the rest of the soldiers. They were still firing their weapons and sealing off all paths of escape. There was little hope left for the miners. Many had been killed, and those who remained had given up on trying to break through the soldiers' blockade. They were trapped, and the cyborg beasts were still chasing them around. People pushed their companions toward the cyborg beasts to save themselves, but they still weren't willing to put up any resistance against the soldiers. Charles didn't like these people, and he didn't want to save them from the hopeless situation they had gotten themselves into. He felt they were only in this position because of their own stupidity. But he reasoned it would be easier to deal with the enemy if these people were no longer a concern. He had to do something to weaken stellar technology. If he allowed stellar technology to continue controlling these people, and after the mining work was done, they would use the people as dispensable shields when they attacked the Dawn Alliance's survival base. That kind of thing had happened before. The Dawn Alliance knew stellar technology couldn't be trusted, and that they would let all their recruits die before they surrendered. The military had tried to warn the people, but no one had believed it. Charles couldn't give the enemy more ammunition to use against the Dawn Alliance. He had to get these people out of there. Charles used the Fire Dragon amulet. A dark blue fire dragon appeared out of nowhere and blew up an armored vehicle, killing the soldiers around it as well. Fire element paranormals could turn their flames into dragons when they reached level 5. Although the dragon-shaped flame was powerful, it wasn't as destructive as the flames produced by the Hellfire amulet. But if a person had enough control over the flame, they could create a dragon-shaped flame with the Hellfire amulet as well. And if they had a profound level of control, they could create a dragon-shaped flame using True Fire, which was a terrifying level of power to possess. If someone with that ability ever tried to attack, even Charles would have to avoid fighting them. Of course, there weren't very many people who could do that. In theory, even those who had reached level 5 didn't have enough power. Normally, only level 6 fire element paranormals could do such a thing. Charles had learned many things the hard way, but he could also use the extract amulet to skip some of the steps of control and comprehension. With enough soul energy, he could use True Fire to create a dragon-shaped flame.